Alright, what's going on everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Marvel Snap video. So after much popular request, we are back with a video for the tier list, doing these weekly tier lists over on Marvel Snap Zone, and now we've got our video element to it returning. Pretty excited to go over the tier list this week. A lot of interesting stuff, pretty diverse meta, and we're finally kind of seeing some decks reach that pinnacle of refinement where they're starting to rise a bit to the top. Plus, we did just get Iron Lad this week, and we're going to be getting some OTA changes on Thursday, so I'm sure things will change a lot between now and next week, but for now, I think we have a pretty good idea of what the meta is looking like. So here's how we're going to break it down this week. We are going to quickly just read through the list we have here, the different tiers. Then we're going to look over some silent performers, and then we're going to go a little bit more in depth on some of the decks in this tier list. We have a ton of decks to go over here, so we're not going to go super in depth on every single deck in the list, but if you want some more in-depth reasoning behind some of these decisions or what these decks are trying to do, definitely recommend checking out the article with the full tier list, link in the description below. As you can see by our shushing friend in the top left corner here, we have entered a Black Bolt meta. And this is pretty amusing because Black Bolt is living through his Leech arc, where he was a card that was very heavily memed on in beta and even after beta post-release. Eventually got buffed from a 5/7 to a 5/8, and now it looks like he is one of the key pieces of a terrorizing meta force in the good cards Stature deck, which is the top of tier 1 as of this list. Looking at the tier list here, tier 1, we have 3 decks that I'm sure you've probably seen a lot of in the past week. First being good card Stature, using Stature, Black Bolt, and the Darkhawk package to much effect. Then we have Sera Control, trying to rein in some of the powerful things these other cards are doing, like the good card Stature deck, and Doomwave Nebula, doing a lot of work. Seems to be rising up as the premier wave deck in the format in favor of other options like Deathwave. We have a pretty wide list here in tier 2, starting with Sera Surfer, acting as a lane controlled deck that can boost up its units with Surfer at the end of the game. Deathwave, which even though it's not as popular as Doomwave, is still putting up some pretty decent results. Discard Dracula, which kind of came back from the dead recently. Discard had been a not so popular archetype, especially in the past metas of the last few months. So really cool to see that one coming back and having a solid amount of success. It's actually what I used for Infinite this month, and I was really surprised at just how good it felt. Dino Darkhawk, very similar to the good card Stature list, but ends up going for a Dino package instead of the Stature stuff. Then we have Lockjaw Thor. So this one, it's really surprising how this deck is still putting up pretty decent numbers and play popularity, even with the nerf to Lockjaw last patch. A lot of people, myself included, thought this might be just too much for the deck, but it seems like it's still going strong, so you really love to see that. It's great when nerfs kind of keep a deck in line without fully removing it from playability. Galactus. So Galactus started out last patch as being one of the more popular meta forces, but as things have changed and as the meta has kind of adjusted to him, Galactus, still while popular and a pretty decent deck, is no longer sporting the pretty crazy play rates it was seeing as of the last patch. And then speaking of popular decks from the last patch, Patriot. Patriot rose up as a way to counter the Galactus and the Electro ramp decks that were very prominent. Those decks have died down in popularity, so as such, Patriot has too, but still does some pretty solid things and performs well even against other decks in the field. So still very solid deck and still seeing a good amount of play. Moving on to tier 3, we have Cerebro 2. So pretty cool to see Cerebro start to make a bit of a resurgence, even if it's not exactly a top tier archetype. Cerebro had a lot of trouble in the past metas, mainly because of the popularity of Thanos really keeping it down, as well as Red Skull just totally messing up your Cerebro. Wasn't much you could do about it. Also got a buff in getting Luke Cage, so more people are trying it out. By no means a top tier deck, but for the many Cerebro enjoyers out there, you'll probably have a bit of a better time with Cerebro 2 now than you have in the past few months. The next two decks we have here in Tier 3 are Electro Ramp and the Bounce deck. This is interesting because these are both decks that were arguably top tier contenders within the past month or so, but seem to have fallen by the wayside a bit as changes have happened and the meta has evolved. I think Electro Ramp is actually a little bit underrated, and it might even be seeing a new resurgence with the release of Iron Lad. However, there's no denying that it has definitely fallen in popularity and power over time, especially with the recent OTA change to Sandman, making him a bit less good of a tempo play. But I do think this deck is kind of a bit underrated right now. And especially if Sera Control and the good card Stature deck stay on top, I think Sandman is ripe to make a return, and this deck has a very solid chance of finding its way higher up on the tier list in the near future. Bounce is interesting because Bounce is an archetype that was arguably pretty high tier that has also fallen by the wayside. I don't think Bounce particularly got a whole lot worse. I think it's an archetype people have less interest in because, well, we're still waiting on Kitty Pryde to rejoin the game. But other than that, I think the show is kind of stolen by the Moon Girl Monkey deck as kind of the way to put out a ton of stats on the final turn. Bounce was also trying to do that, and the Moon Girl Monkey deck kind of incorporates a lot of the elements that Bounce had. So I think that's one of the reasons that Bounce isn't quite as good as it used to be, because I think a lot of the Bounce players ended up playing that deck instead, because it just seems like a better deck right now, at least. Then we have some Zoo decks, both the Thanos Ongoing and the Kazoo Dracula variety. Zoo has always been held down a bit by the presence of Killmonger in the meta, and when Sera is a very popular deck, you're definitely going to see Zoo hurting a bit. I do think Zoo is generally an underrated archetype, but for the time being, due to its weakness to Killmonger, which is a very common inclusion in a lot of different decks, I think Zoo will always have its kind of power capped, but I do think it is an underrated archetype, and it can definitely take people by surprise, and they're not going to have their Killmonger every game, or you can try and tech against it with things like Armor and Cosmo. Definitely not a top tier archetype by any means, but I do think it can do a bit better than people expect of it, but definitely a bit lower down on the list this week, both for the Thanos version and the version that tries to go a bit taller with Dracula and other big things. And then the last deck here on tier 3, we have Hela Discard, always been a bit of a casino deck. However, that being said, what you lack in consistency, you make up for in power, because Hela outputs a ridiculous amount of power. Always been a big fan of Hela, and admittedly, she's probably a deck you never really want to see being in the tier 1 section, just due to the RNG nature of her effect. And then rounding it out with tier 4 here, we have Thanos Junk and Thanos Control all the way at the bottom, as well as Move and Negative. These have just been kind of inconsistent archetypes. I do think the Thanos Control deck is in need of further refining. There are like a million different versions of it going around, so I think that deck has much more than tier 4 potential, but for the time being, it's really up in the air, and also there's so much Enchantress going around that leaning on the ongoing effects, which is typically what the Thanos Control deck seems to do, is a little bit trickier right now. I do think these decks will rise up, or at least the Thanos decks will rise up a bit as they get refined and as the meta is a bit more solidified. But for now, into a kind of wide variety of decks in the field, it just isn't really feeling the greatest, it seems. And a big reason I also think that these Thanos decks are doing worse is because of Darkhawk. You know, when a lot of the decks in the meta have Darkhawk, you are essentially just giving your opponent a bigger Darkhawk for free, while also making your deck more inconsistent at drawing the cards you want to get. So Thanos always not going to be appreciating when Darkhawk is a big part of the meta like it is right now. Move and Negative, not much to say here. These decks have been pretty mediocre for a while. I'm a believer in Negative, but anytime you look at the stats, it always paints a pretty depressing picture for the archetype. But he's also another one where you probably don't ever want Negative to be the top of tier 1, but definitely an archetype that seems to be struggling a bit in the recent meta. Move has just kind of lacked the pieces for a while, though that might be changing with the next season in June when it gets some upgrades, but until then, don't really expect much else to develop from it. Before we move on to a little bit more in-depth analysis of some of the decks on the tier list, let's take a look at this week's Silent Performers. Silent Performers are decks that don't have an incredible amount of data behind them just yet, definitely a bit less popular, but with the limited amount of data we do have, we're seeing they are putting up pretty promising results. So two of these decks here are Shuri decks. The first Shuri deck we have here is a slightly different take on the Stature Black Bolt shenanigans. We do have a bit more protection with this version. We are running armor. We're also running Captain Marvel to potentially get in a closed down lane, and the She-Hulk Taskmaster stuff for more consistent ways of copying a big Shuri thing, especially on the final turn. Vision's pretty nice because he gives some added flexibility not only in moving around to lock down lanes, but he makes himself harder to get Shang-Chi'd if you make a big one with Shuri. Black Bolt, Stature, just doing really good stuff right now, so getting a nice stat boost on them seems pretty solid. Other than that, Psylocke here, I believe, for the She-Hulk stuff, seems like a strange include, but it has been working out for some. Rocket Raccoon was one people were trying out as another 1-drop to fit in on the final turn, but I think he's actually going to end up getting cut for Nebula, just being a bit more consistent of a high power 1-drop. But this seems like a very solid direction to go in if you're looking to do the Stature Black Bolt stuff, but value going a bit taller than the opponents. And then we have the revision to the classic Shuri deck, and it's going in the Sauron direction now. Sauron removing a bunch of pretty negative ongoing effects here from our cards, like Ebony Maw, the recently nerfed Lizard, Typhoid Mary, Red Skull. Not much to say about this one. Pretty standard, very similar to a lot of the lists we saw before, but again, just seems like an archetype people moved away from maybe too quickly, even though it can still do some powerful things, and especially so now that Shang-Chi is seeing a bit of a reduction of play. Another interesting deck here we don't want to forget about is the She-Not deck. So this is Infinite. Always love seeing the Infinite pop up. This is one I feel like always pops up on season reset. There's always like one person getting to Infinite early with this deck. I do think it's a neat deck. I'm still not really sure about the consistency of it. I think if you're doing Zabu stuff and making big things, you probably just want to go in another direction, but you could argue this is a bit more of a budget-friendly list as it's just using the pass card, Nebula, and Zabu. Everything else is Series 3 or below, so that's nice at least. But the idea with this deck is we are trying to pass on 5 into playing She-Hulk and Infinite on the final turn, sometimes double She-Hulks. That's why we have the Psylocke here, because we can go Psylocke on turn 4, then we can pass turn 5, hopefully pump a Sunspot, and then go She-Hulk or double She-Hulk, Infinite. We also have Dracula for those times where we aren't able to set up playing our Infinite. We can just have Dracula discard it. Pretty solid deck. It's never really gotten overly popular, and I think that's going to remain the case, but pretty interesting direction to go if you want something that's a little bit more budget friendly. One more deck I want to mention here that wasn't on the tier list, but I think deserves a spot in this section, and that is the Moon Girl Monkey deck. So this one puts out a ton of power. It's basically using Moon Girl to copy up our powerful cards like She-Hulk, like Hit Monkey, like the Hood Demon. We're using Quinjet to reduce those cards. Quinjet may not reduce below 1, however, with She-Hulk, the copy actually does get reduced to 0, which is pretty cool. And you just put out a ridiculous amount of stats with Hitmonkey on the final turn. Very powerful deck. The other nice thing about this deck is because we're like bouncing our stuff and we're holding for the final turn, it's very easy to throw priority, so it's very hard for the opponent to actually Shang-Chi our big things. I think the main reason people moved away from this deck is because even though it's good, basically what you're doing is just trying to output a huge amount of stats going into the final turn. And I think you can just do that a little bit better with some of the other decks we're going to take a look at here in Tier 1. They can also put out a similar, if not more, amount of stats, while on top of that, disrupting the opponent with things like rocks. And because of that, I think Moon Monkey is just not really that popular anymore, even though it's actually a very good deck. Let's take a look at the Tier 1 decks here, though. Good card Stature. I don't think there's a whole ton to say about this deck. People have been playing it for like a week or so now, maybe a little longer. and it is just ridiculous. And as the stats keep rolling in, the deck looks better and better. Definitely positioned as kind of the deck to beat right now. Black Bolt is really doing insane amounts of work. I believe he has over a 60% drawn win rate right now over a large sample size, which is pretty crazy. I actually wouldn't be surprised if they decided to take a little off the top of his stats and revert him to a 5/7, but we'll see. Overall, the reason this deck is so successful is because it leverages Zabu very effectively. It is not weak into wave because both Stature and Miles are able to cost 1 through a wave effect, which is very, very powerful versus what would otherwise probably be a good counter for this style of deck. We're packing very efficient removal in Shang-Chi and Enchantress, and being able to play them for cheaper with Zabu is really, really good. The Rock Disruption, anytime you have a deck that is disrupting the opponent while advancing your own game plan, I don't care if it's Snap, Hearthstone, Magic, any card game, that is a good thing. And that is one of the reasons we're seeing this Darkhawk package persist in so many different decks, because it is disrupting the opponent with rocks while also advancing our own game plan, which here is to grow the Darkhawk while also just playing fairly reasonably statted stuff to help that plan. So yeah, this deck lets out a lot of stats. It's very versatile. It just doesn't feel like there's any one deck that you run into and you say, oh no, it's going to be a terrible time. That being said, Sandman definitely looks like it might be able to come back as a bit of a counter, as that is the one thing that, you know, really disrupts the ability to play this Stature for 1 on the final turn, or the Miles, or playing, you know, 2 powerful 4-drops with Zabu. So if there's one thing that does end up kind of coming back out of the woodwork to try and take this down a peg, might be Sandman, I think. Next up for Tier 1 is Sera Control. So a lot of different versions of this going around. This one we're opting to pack the Absorbing Man so we can basically rebuy some of our powerful tech effects, namely Shang-Chi and Enchantress, which is pretty good because sometimes you're taking a gamble on where the opponent is going to be playing their cards, so being able to just slam an Enchantress in the right lane and then copy it in the left lane is sometimes good enough. I think the tricky thing about Sera Control, even though it's a really, really good deck right now, is sometimes you just don't draw the tech you need when you need it, and then the deck feels like it falls really flat. But when you do have your tech, it just feels so incredibly good. It's also pretty resilient versus locations because of the Scarlet Witch and some builds running Jeff. Definitely got some improvements with Hitmonkey and Mysterio. Mysterio was already good in the deck. Hitmonkey made it better. It just is pretty good at being able to deal with a lot of the other popular decks in the meta. However, because of the Stature deck being the most popular deck, I do think we are seeing a bit of, you know, awareness to the fact that, oh man, Shang-Chi is so prominent that I want to run as many cards as I can that kind of dodge these tech cards, which is one of the reasons the Stature deck seems so good right now, is because outside of Darkhawk, which can get Shanged or Enchantress, none of their cards are really vulnerable to tech cards. And I do think that has an impact on the Sera deck, because the Sera deck doesn't much care for getting disrupted with rocks. It's kind of annoying. And it, you know, when your tech cards, when you have them and they aren't, you know, swinging the game, they feel pretty bad. So I do think that if the Stature deck stays on top, it's possible this deck actually goes down a little bit, just because it doesn't have really the tools to fight that outside of mainly Enchantress or sometimes Shang. But it'll be interesting to see as it develops. I would not be surprised if the Darkhawk version of Sera ends up becoming the more popular version of this, because Sera might need to pivot to a more proactive game plan rather than a purely reactive one like we see here. And then we have a Doomwave Nebula deck. This one was from Shade Says. We featured it on the Infinite Decks of the Week. One thing worth noting is that Goose isn't quite the guaranteed lockout with Wave like it was previously before that deck got popular. So that is a card you might want to substitute, as it just doesn't really have the same appeal as it did initially. That being said, I do think Doom Wave is probably the best Wave deck, and this one features kind of a lockdown package, pretty light one, but we're using Storm in combination with Nebula, and having access to the close down lane with things like Jeff, Sunspot for pumping with the She-Hulk. She-Hulk obviously good with Wave. A lot of pretty standard stuff here. We are running Enchantress as our main piece of removal because it just hits so many decks out there right now. Cool seeing Jessica Jones appear here again. Obviously good synergy with Storm. Chavez for that draw consistency, and sometimes she's not the worst thing in the world to play if we didn't get such a great hand. Doom is always really good at being able to go wide in these storm decks, and especially when you're trying to limit your opponent to 1 card a turn with Wave, and then obviously She-Hulk getting it down for only 2 cost with the Wave, really good on the final turn. The thing with Doom Wave is, even though it's good right now, the Wave effect has traditionally been one of the more powerful reasons for playing a deck like this, limiting your opponent to 1 card for the final turn, acting as a pseudo Sandman. And unfortunately for Wave, Stature and Miles get under this, and I do think that is making her a bit worse. By no means bad, but just not quite as powerful of a, oh, you can only play 1 card now on the final turn as she was before. So for that reason, I don't think this is going to kind of take over the other decks in Tier 1, but I think it still puts up a really strong fight against those decks, and probably more importantly, the rest of the field. And moving on to some decks in Tier 2 here, starting out with Sera Surfer. I've played quite a bit of Surfer. Surfer is leaning on the lockdown stuff, so we're just trying to make it awkward for the opponent to play cards where they want to, with things like Goose and Storm, Juggernaut, while also just kind of spreading the power around pretty efficiently with cards like Mr. Fantastic, interacting with Polaris. Killmonger still a really, really good card right now because of all the Nebula going around. Sera Surfer, it's still a very efficient list, but I do feel like a lot of the time when I'm playing this deck, I'd rather just be playing Sera Control. I find myself really missing the Enchantress, really missing the Shang-Chi at times. So while this deck is a solid choice if you're looking for some lane lockdown shenanigans, if you're looking for a Sera-focused deck, I do find the Sera Control or Sera Darkhawk decks seem to perform a bit more consistently. Then we have Deathwave. I think Deathwave's just kind of fine right now. I'd argue it's actually pretty close to Doomwave because people don't play around Arrow anymore, and she can be very impactful still. But much like the Doomwave list, I think Deathwave here is suffering from the fact that the most popular deck in the game has ways to get through Wave. And because of that, we're really kind of limiting what, the best we can do with this deck is, because obviously, when we get our She-Hulk and our Death, and we have an Arrow or a Doom to go with it, and we can play all those on the final turn, that's more power output than the Stature deck is typically getting. However, the problem is, that's not happening every game. That's not happening the majority of your games, even. So, how good is the deck when, we're only getting, let's say, Wave into Doom She-Hulk, or Arrow She-Hulk, or Arrow Death? It's probably alright. But then the games where we don't draw our Wave, or if we draw this deck kind of out of order and get a lot of unplayable cards instead of the stuff we're trying to destroy to enable our payoffs, it feels pretty bad. So I do think it's a decent deck. It's one you have to be very vigilant about retreating with when you have bad hands. Not a bad way to go, but because of the prevalence of the Stature deck, I do think in general, Wave decks are a bit softer right now than they were previously. Then we have Discard. Discard, been seeing a resurgence lately, really cool. Nebula was a great addition to it, made Storm a lot better in the archetype. And the big thing about Discard is that it can kind of put a lot of the other best decks in the game on awkward 50-50s, where they have to kind of take a guess where you're going to play your big thing, or they just lose the game sometimes. It's also more resilient to Shang-Chi because Dracula can't be shanged effectively, which is really nice. Or Enchantress for that matter, and with Storm, we often can protect our Morbius by getting him in the Storm lane before the opponent is able to Enchantress him. One upgrade I would recommend if you have it for this deck is Jeff. Jeff goes really well in the Hell Cow slot, giving us another way to play into the Storm lane, and just some added flexibility of moving around towards the end of the game. If you don't have Jeff, another cool inclusion that you might want to consider is Iceman. This deck just does very powerful things on its own, so sometimes weaving in a 1-drop that disrupts your opponent's curve can be a really nice addition to help you get there and kind of have a better final turn than the opponent's able to because their curve was interrupted. The other cool thing about Discard is we have Swarm, so sometimes that works against the opponent with their Black Bolt, and that's something I've really liked. I've actually even tried the Swarm Colleen package in the Stature deck because of all the mirror matches, and it was decently effective there, so that's another thing you can consider if you're seeing a whole lot of that deck. Then we have Devil Dino Darkhawk, and I think this is definitely one of the higher tier 2 decks. Does a lot of the powerful things that the Stature deck is doing, but we're going the Devil Dino route with Quinjet, Moon Girl, copying things with Mystique. This deck was really good. I played it a ton last month and a little bit this month, and it's definitely a very solid choice if you like doing Devil Dino things. I think the biggest downside that this deck has is it's a little bit softer to some of the counter cards going around, mainly Enchantress and Shang-Chi. We have quite a few things for the opponent to Enchantress here, so that definitely feels a little bit bad if we can't get our Cosmo up for protection. But other than that, it's still a really solid deck, and one that I expect to actually get even better with the addition of Iron Lad, which we got the other day. This definitely serves as a bit more of a budget alternative if you really like the Darkhawk style of stuff, but are missing pieces for the Stature deck. I think Devil Dino is a great one to aim towards. Then we have the Thor Lockjaw deck. This is one I was happy to see survive the recent balance changes to Lockjaw. Still a very strong deck. Definitely wasn't as neutered by the change as I thought it might be. The big downside about this deck, and I think what's going to be keeping it tier 2 for now, is simply the fact that we are really, really weak to Shang-Chi. And honestly, there's not a whole lot you can do about that. On the plus side, we're not really weak to Enchantress, which, given that she is a bit more popular than Shang right now, at least in my experience, that's kind of an upside for this deck. But that doesn't mean people aren't playing Shang-Chi, just that there's a little bit less of it than there was before, which was basically Shang in every deck. So I do think that is a bit of the weakness to the Thor Lockjaw deck, even though it's able to kind of outpower a lot of decks if it gets rolling with its Lockjaw stuff, or even just with, cheating stuff into play with Jubilee or Dracula. I think the big downside to it is you are very soft to Shang-Chi, and if they Shang one of your lanes, this isn't a deck where we're often winning in 3 lanes, so if one lane gets swung, that often means you lose the game. But when they don't have an answer, this is one of the decks that puts out the most power in the entire game. And for that reason, I think it definitely merits a bit of respect and earns its tier 2 spot. Then we have Patriot. Patriot has seen a little bit of a fall from its previous tier 1 status, and there are a few simple reasons for that. One, Enchantress got buffed, and when Enchantress gets better, Patriot is probably going to get worse. But I don't actually think that's the main reason we saw Patriot see a decline. I think the main reason we saw that is because the 2 most popular decks in the meta previously were ones that Patriot was favored into, and that was Galactus and Electro Ramp. Both of those decks have gotten knocked down a peg or more. And so with them not being nearly as popular forces in the meta, Patriot gets worse because, that's why we were playing Patriot a lot of the time, was to farm those decks. Still a good deck. You can still win with Patriot. There are new builds being experimented with, especially with the addition of Iron Lad. This is a pretty stock list, just going the Ultron route, although we do have Onslaught for a bit of a surprise. Just get out a ton of power with the ongoing effects, though admittedly it is a little more dangerous to stack your ongoing effects right now, but sometimes we'll just have to take that risk, and that's why we have Cosmo on the list for a bit of protection. But yeah, you can't go wrong with Patriot. It's still a good deck, but it definitely isn't the kind of tier 1 meta force that's countering these other tier 1 decks that it was a few weeks ago. And the last deck we're taking a look at here is Galactus. So with Galactus, the funny thing about Galactus is he was like super duper popular, and then the Patriot started popping up more and it knocked him down a peg. The funny thing is, with how the meta seems to be turning, I would not be surprised if Galactus is actually going to be on the rise this week. And the reason for that is the most popular deck in the game, the Stature Black Bolt deck, doesn't really have great answers to Galactus. Pretty much the only thing they have is they either have Polaris to pull one of our cheap things to mess up Galactus, or sometimes they'll have the Shang-Chi if they can throw priority, but that's usually pretty hard for them to do. So I think Galactus is actually kind of primed to make a comeback if that deck stays as popular as it is. So keep an eye out on Galactus. It definitely fell a bit in popularity because it was so popular, everybody was targeting it. You were just seeing debris everywhere. You were seeing all the Galactus counters were coming out of the woodwork, and so rightfully it fell in popularity a bit because it does not appreciate counters. No surprises there. I do think this is the most resilient version of Galactus. Doing the Nimrod stuff gives you a really good backup plan, and sometimes you just end up being kind of an accidental Shuri deck where you go ramp into Shuri, Destroyer, Taskmaster, and it kind of works out. So I think this deck definitely appreciates being able to pivot from the Galactus plan if that's not working out, while still being able to be a very effective Galactus deck in its own right. Definitely keep your eye on this one. I'd not be surprised if it starts creeping its way up the tier list in the coming weeks. To close out, just going to give some general thoughts on the tier 3 and tier 4 section instead of going into all of them and then making this a 30 or 40 minute video. Just some quick thoughts. Electro ramp, I think, is positioned to at least bump its way back up to tier 2. A lot of the top decks really don't appreciate a Sandman or a Leech, so I would not be surprised if those cards start making a comeback and making Sandman better again, so keep an eye out for that. Also, Bounce, we are going to be getting Kitty Pryde returning to the game, and everyone being gifted her for free, I believe next week is when the patch is expected. So when that happens, Bounce is obviously going to see a rise in play rate, as well as probably win rate. Kitty Pryde was really, really good in that deck, and even though she's slightly different now, she still looks very, very well positioned for that style of deck. So I think Bounce is definitely going to start clawing its way up as well once Kitty returns to the game soon. I also think that the Thanos decks have a chance to make a resurgence. It's tricky in a Darkhawk meta because having a bigger deck versus Darkhawk decks is really, really bad, but it is really hard to keep the Mad Titan down. Thanos has proved resilient in all kinds of metas, but since he is a bit more complicated of a deck due to more cards in it, he takes a lot more time to figure out and refine. So would not be surprised if you see Thanos getting a bit better in the following weeks. And don't be surprised if you see Thanos just starting to incorporate cards from other good lists, like the Stature package or the Darkhawk package. I'm honestly surprised more people haven't been experimenting with that in Thanos already, but it's definitely a direction I could see the Thanos decks taking to try and stay relevant. And there we have it. That is going to do it for this week's Marble Snap meta tier list. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below, and if you want to try any of these decks for yourself, link in the description to the article where you can get the deck codes and read up for more information on all of the decks we have listed here. And if you enjoyed it, remember to like, subscribe, and stay tuned here on the Marble Snap Zone YouTube channel for all your Marble Snap content. If you like the stuff I do here on Snap Zone, feel free to check out my links in the description where I do pretty much daily Snap content as well. That's going to wrap it up for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.